Aristotle introduces the doctrine of the mean in Book 2 of his Nicomachean Ethics, almost immediately after he establishes that virtue is a hexis, so a settled disposition of character. And he tells us that this hexis has a very specific structure and that every single virtue is a mean between two opposed extremes, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness, and generosity is the mean between miserliness and profligacy. This structure is present in Aristotle's whole treatment of the virtues and of the rest of his ethics. But the doctrine of the mean is also one of the more misunderstood ideas in Aristotle. And the common misunderstanding, or the common version of the misunderstanding, is that the doctrine of the mean is just a recommendation of moderation. It is not. Aristotle is not telling us to find the middle or to avoid every extreme or to be measured in all things. In fact, in Book 2 of his Nicomachean Ethics, he rules out this interpretation almost as soon as he introduces the concept itself. Now, the confusion usually comes from treating the mean as though it were just some mathematical midpoint. But Aristotle's point is precisely that ethical judgment does not work that way. He distinguishes between two kinds of mean. So the arithmetical mean, which is the midpoint between two quantities, and the mean that is relative to us, which is really the only kind of mean that matters in ethics. 10 is the arithmetical mean between 2 and 18, and to get there you usually just average them. But this kind of averaging tells us nothing about how we should act in our own lives. And Aristotle uses the example of food intake to make his point. He says that if 10 pounds of food is too much for a man, then 2 pounds is too little for another man, then the trainer doesn't just simply prescribe 6 pounds because it is the mean or arithmetical mean. The trainer actually prescribes what is right for the man right in front of him. For someone like Milo the wrestler, 6 pounds might just be a bit too little. But for an ordinary man, 6 pounds might just be a bit too much. In other words, the mean is usually relative to the person at hand, or it has to fit the person that we are actually taking into consideration. So the point here is that the mean is not a quantity, it is a target. And this target moves. It moves with the person who is doing the acting, and it moves with the situation that is being acted in. Which means that what is right for one person is not right for another. And what is right in one circumstance is of course not right in a different circumstance. The mean always has to be located freshly each and every time, depending on the exact circumstances and the exact person. And this is why the doctrine of the mean cannot just be reduced to a simple rule, because rules work by abstracting away the particulars. A rule says that in case this happens, you should do that. And the moment you have a rule to work with, you can usually just apply it without having really to perceive the exact case at hand in any depth. But Aristotle is saying that ethical situations, at least, don't work that way. The variability that matters here cannot just simply be removed, and two situations that look similar on the surface can call for complete opposite responses, because the people involved in these situations are different, the moral content can also be different, and the timing can also be different. And a rule that captures all of these variables, this just simply won't be a rule anymore. Instead, it would just be the thing that the mean already is, which is a target that has to be located situationally. So if the mean cannot be reduced to a rule, then something has to find this mean, right? But this something, it can't be reasoning that operates from rules either, because in this case, you would just be moving the same problem one level up. So whatever finds the mean, it has to perceive the case as it actually is, including the person acting and the situation containing them. It has to read the particulars of the case accurately. And this accurate reading of particulars is not a procedure. It is, according to Aristotle, a developed capacity. Now, the faculty that finds the mean in any particular case is what Aristotle calls phronesis, We've talked about phronesis before, like in the praxis and poiesis video, as the developed capacity to judge what a situation calls for, and we've also talked about or used it to substantiate our argument in the previous video on decorum, where phronesis is the perception that lets a man read each occasion or situation correctly. Now in Book 6 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle defines phronesis as a true disposition accompanied by reason toward action in things that are good or bad for a human being. And what makes this definition important is the word disposition. Phronesis isn't just something that you know, it is something you are. It is a settled state of character that produces accurate judgment in particular cases, and it is developed across years of acting, observing the consequences of those actions and letting those observations refine the next round of judgment or action. And here, Aristotle is repeatedly explicit that phronesis works through perception. It is closer to seeing than to reasoning. According to Aristotle, the person of practical wisdom does not deduce what the situation calls for. He sees what it calls for. And the seeing is the result of a formation that has trained his perception to recognize what is actually present and called for in the case right in front of him. And Aristotle used the language or the word of perception throughout Book 6. He says that phronesis is concerned with particulars and that grasping a particular is itself a kind of seeing, like the way you see that the thing in front of you is a triangle. He compares what the person of practical wisdom does when he reads a situation to what a trained eye does when it looks at an object. The trained physician, for example, sees that his patient's condition calls for a specific treatment in a way that someone that is untrained in medicine cannot see or perceive. The trained navigator reads the conditions of the sea and acts accordingly in a way that someone without that particular training cannot. And the man of practical wisdom reads a moral situation in the exact same way. The reading itself is perceptual. So, once you understand it this way, then a lot of what Aristotle says about moral education starts to make a bit more sense. In Book 6, he says that practical wisdom is only acquired through experience and not through theoretical instruction. He says that young men can become mathematicians and geometers, but they can't become particularly wise by studying, because phronesis requires a long acquaintance with the actual situations of life that only experience can provide. And here he is not making a casual point or a plead about needing to grow up. What he's actually saying is that perception itself is developed, and that development happens only by being placed repeatedly in situations where perception has to function and where the consequences of getting something wrong can be observed and absorbed. In other words, phronesis is a trained faculty of accurate perception in concrete cases. It locates the mean by perceiving the particulars of any given situation, including the person acting in it, and the moral content of what is at stake. And this perception isn't merely an addition to reasoning. It is what produces the right judgment in the first place, because only reasoning that proceeds from accurate perception can be reliable. And any reasoning that begins from an inaccurate perception, however technically competent this reasoning is, this will still misjudge the situation at hand. Now, the doctrine of the mean is often presented as if it worked the same way for every single person. There is always a virtue, right? There are always two opposed vices or failures, and the mean just simply sits between them, and what each and every person has to do is just simply aim at a mean. But Aristotle is clear that this isn't quite how it works. He says fairly explicitly in Book 2 that the mean isn't equidistant from the two failures, and that each person isn't equidistant from the mean either. Some of us are naturally pulled toward one of the extremes, and some of us are naturally pulled toward the other extreme. And as a result of this, the work of the formation is usually not the same for every single person. And Aristotle uses an analogy from carpentry to explain this a bit better. He says that when men want to straighten a piece of warped wood, they usually don't just aim for the middle. They pull it in the opposite direction from where it is actually bent, because the wood, when it is left to itself, usually just returns to its bent state, right? So you have to overcorrect against the bend to actually bring it into the way you actually want it. And this is what Aristotle says we should do with our own characters. We should aim away from the extreme we are naturally pulled toward and pull harder in the exact opposite direction. Because if we aim straight at the mean, our nature will inevitably pull us back toward the extremes, and we'll just end up settled into that extreme instead of settled at the mean we actually intend. So the mean is one thing in the abstract, but the work of finding that mean will be different for each and every one of us, because each and every one of us starts somewhere that is different, and we are also pulled in slightly different directions depending on our character and temperament. And this means that there is something Aristotle is asking of us that the doctrine of the mean doesn't really make obvious at all in the beginning. He is essentially asking each of us to know accurately which of the two extremes we are more inclined toward. And this isn't just a generic question of whether we know ourselves or not, because the person who is naturally cautious has to know that he is naturally cautious, and the person who is naturally bold also has to know that about himself. And the man whose anger runs hot has to know it, just like the man whose anger runs cold has to know this, because the work of this formation depends entirely on knowing which actual direction we have to forcefully correct against. And this is a bit harder than it sounds, because normally most of us don't really see our quote-unquote tilt accurately. We see the tilt that we wish we had. And what I mean by this is that the natural cautious person, he often imagines himself bolder than he actually is, and the naturally bold person often imagines himself more measured than he actually is. So the accurate self-perception that megalopsychia required, which we have talked about in a previous video, is the exact same perception that this demands. We have to see how our nature actually is, how our temperament actually is, and not what we would prefer it to be. So once we can see ourselves accurately and clearly, then the work can begin. And this is not the work at aiming at the mean, because aiming at the mean, as we have just discussed before, this will just leave us in the failure we are naturally drawn toward. The actual work is the work of pulling deliberately and over a long time in the opposite direction. And we do this not because the opposite direction is always correct, but simply because that pulling in this direction is what will produce a character that doesn't automatically return to the bent state or to our nature when we are not paying attention anymore. This is also why the work of formation is very personal, and why it can't really be transferred from one person to another in the form of some advice or protocol. Because the advice that is right for one person, this can be the exact wrong advice for another, because the directions we need to pull, they may be the complete opposite of each other. The person who needs to learn to be more cautious and the person who needs to learn to be more bold, both persons are working at the same virtue, which is courage, but they are doing the opposite work to get there. So general advice about virtue given to everyone in the same way, this advice usually just ends up reinforcing each person's existing tilt instead of actually correcting it. Now, naturally, this raises another question that the previous part didn't quite answer. And the question is that if the work is asymmetric, and if it requires constant pulling against one's own nature, then does the formed life ever feel restful? Or is the person of practical wisdom constantly and always working against himself? And Aristotle's answer to this is no, since the pulling actually produces something. The wood, once it has been straightened correctly, this piece of wood isn't constantly threatening to bend back, just like the character that has been pulled constantly or correctly for a long enough time will become a character that no longer requires the pulling. And Aristotle is explicit about this in Book 2. He tells us that the man of virtue takes pleasure in virtuous action because the virtue has become his nature and not something he has to constantly keep working against. The continence and discipline required of someone still in the process of formation will be replaced in the formed person by a settled disposition that does the right thing without much effort on their part. So, what the formed life actually looks like from the inside isn't a constant struggle against our nature. It is just the condition of having done the work and of having become, through the work, someone whose tilt has been reshaped or corrected. The person who once had to pull against caution to act with courage, this person will no longer have to pull. He will just act with courage because his character is now actually courageous, and not because his original cautious nature has been suppressed and will have to be suppressed indefinitely. And this is what actually produces the inhabited quality of the formed life. Because the person who has done the work, this person doesn't have to think about what to do in most situations anymore. He doesn't have to deliberate about whether he should pull against his old tilt or not. The old tilt simply isn't there anymore. What's there instead is a character that responds correctly to the situation in front of him without effort and also without unnecessary strain. This is also what the previous video on decorum was describing when we said that the formed man inhabits the form and doesn't just merely perform it. The form is the natural expression of someone for whom the asymmetric work is already behind him. He doesn't have to manage how he appears or how he behaves, because the appearance and his behavior just follows from what he actually is. He also doesn't have to manage what he says, because the speech flows from the exact same character. And he also doesn't have to manage how he reads situations, because the reading actually comes from a perception that years of continuous formations have shaped. But of course, none of this will be automatic, and it is not effortless either in the sense of being given. It is effortless in the specific sense that the effort has already been made, and that what remains is just simply what the effort produced. The person who hasn't done the work, he doesn't just get to skip to the end, because the character that responds correctly without excessive deliberation is, by definition, the character that strained correctly in the right direction and for a long enough period of time. So, ultimately, this is the question the doctrine of the mean puts to us. It is not whether we know what virtue is, because most of us will know that. And it is also not whether we can name the extremes we want to avoid, because we can usually do that too. The question is more so whether we know our own tilt and whether we are doing the asymmetric work that our particular nature actually requires. Because the person who knows the doctrine but doesn't know his tilt, or who knows his tilt but doesn't put in the work, this person will end up at the same place as the person who never really gave the matter a second of thought. The virtue will not form itself. It only forms when a particular person with a particular tilt pulls deliberately against that tilt for a long enough period of time. So the question ultimately is really about whether or not this formation is actually happening in our lives, not whether we understand what the mean is in the abstract, and also not whether we can describe or articulate what virtue would look like if we had it. The actual question is whether the specific work of our specific nature is actually the work we are doing, because that is the only thing that will produce a character whose perception of the mean is reliable over time.